Welcome to the stream. I am the Invisible Man. We are at Chapter 5, The Burglary at the Vicarage. The facts of the burglary at the Vicarage came to us chiefly through the medium of the Vicar and his wife. It occurred in the small hours of Whit Monday, the day devoted in Iping to the club festivities. Mrs. Bunting, it seems, woke up suddenly in the stillness that comes before the dawn with the strong impression that the door of their bedroom had been opened and closed. She did not arouse her husband at first, but sat up in bed listening. She then distinctly heard the pad, pad, pad of bare feet coming out of the adjoining dressing room and walking along the passage towards the staircase. As soon as she felt assured of this, she aroused the Reverend Mr. Bunting as quietly as possible. He did not strike a light, but putting on his spectacles, her dressing gown, and his bath slippers, he went out on the landing to listen. He heard quite distinctly a fumbling going on at his study desk downstairs, and then a violent sneeze. At that he returned to his bedroom, armed himself with the most obvious weapon, the poker, and descended the staircase as noiselessly as possible. Mrs. Bunting came out on the landing. The hour was about 4, and the ultimate darkness of the night was past. Hello, un jugador normal. Welcome back. How are you? There was a faint shimmer of light in the hall, but the study doorway yawned impenetrably black. Everything was still except the faint creaking of the stairs under Mr. Bunting's tread and the slight movements in the study. Then something snapped, the drawer was opened, and there was a rustle of papers. Then came an impression, and a match was struck, and the study was flooded with yellow light. Mr. Bunting was now in the hall, and through the crack of the door he could see the desk and open the drawer, and a candle burning on the desk. But the robber he could not see. He stood there in the hall, undecided what to do, and Mrs. Bunting, her face white and intent, crept slowly downstairs after him. One thing kept Mr. Bunting's courage, the persuasion that this burglar was a resident in the village. Ooh, I am invisible sometimes. The formula is unstable. They heard the chink of money and realized that the robber had found the housekeeping reserve of gold, £2.10 in half sovereigns altogether. At that sound, Mr. Bunting was nerved to abrupt action. Gripping the poker firmly, he rushed into the room, closely followed by Mrs. Bunting. "Surrender!" cried Mr. Bunting fiercely, and then stooped, amazed. Apparently, the room was perfectly empty. Yet their conviction that they had that very moment heard somebody moving in the room had amounted to a certainty. For half a minute, perhaps, they stood gaping. Then Mrs. Bunting went across the room and looked behind the screen, while Mr. Bunting, by a kindred impulse, peered under the desk. Then Mrs. Bunting turned back the window curtains, and Mr. Bunting looked up the chimney and probed it with the poker. Then Mrs. Bunting scrutinized the waste paper basket, and Mr. Bunting opened the lid of the coal scuttle. Then they came to a stop and stood with eyes interrogating each other. "I could have sworn," said Mr. Bunting. "The candle," said Mr. Bunting. "Who lit the candle?" "The drawer," said Mr. Bunting, "and the money's gone." She went hastily to the doorway. Of all the strange occurrences, There was a violent sneeze in the passage. They rushed out, and as they did so, the kitchen door slammed. "Bring the candle," said Mr. Bunting, and led the way. They both heard a sound of bolts being hastily shot back. As he opened the kitchen door, he saw through the scullery that the back door was just opening, and the faint light of early dawn displayed the dark masses of the garden beyond. Hang on, the scullery? I need to look that up. Oops.
Scullery.
Scullery, a small kitchen or room at the back of the house used for washing dishes and other dirty household work. I want to make sure I'm saying vicarage right. Vicar, is it vicarage or vicarage? Now that I'm here, vicarage.
Vicarage.
Vicarage. I was saying it wrong. The residence of a vicar. Is it vicar or vicar? Vicarage.
Vicar.
It is vicar. Vicarage. Vicar. Got it. She went hastily to the doorway. Of all the strange occurrences. There was a violent sneeze in the passage. They rushed out. As they did so, the kitchen door slammed. "Bring the candle," said Mr. Bunting, and led the way. They both heard a sound of bolts being hastily shot back. As he opened the kitchen door, he saw through the scullery that the back door was just opening, and the faint light of early dawn displayed the dark masses of the garden beyond. He is certain that nothing went out of the door. It opened, stood open for a moment, and then closed with a slam. As it did so, the candle Mrs. Bunting was carrying from the study flickered and flared. It was a minute or more before they entered the kitchen. "Oh yes, I'm from USA, un jugador normal." The place was empty. They refastened the back door, examined the kitchen, pantry, and scullery thoroughly, and at last went down into the cellar. There was not a soul to be found in the house, search as they would. Daylight found the vicar and his wife, a quaintly costumed little couple, still marveling about on their own ground floor by the unnecessary light of a guttering candle. Chapter 6. The Furniture That Went Mad. Now it happened that in the early hours of Whit Monday, before Milly was hunted out for the day, Mr. and Mrs. Hall both rose and went noiselessly down into the cellar. Their business there was of private nature and had something to do with the specific gravity of their beer. They had hardly entered the cellar when Mrs. Hall found she had forgotten to bring down a bottle of sarsaparilla from their joint room. As she was the expert and principal operator in this affair, Hall very properly went upstairs for it. "Yes, I practiced Spanish a little bit." On the landing, he was surprised to see that the stranger's door was ajar. He went on into his own room and found the bottle as he had been directed. But returning with the bottle, he noticed that the bolts of the front door had been shot back, that the door was in fact simply on the latch, and with a flash of inspiration, he connected this with the stranger's room upstairs, and the suggestions of Mr. Teddy Henfrey. He distinctly remembered holding the candle while Mrs. Hall shot these bolts overnight. At the sight, he stopped, gaping, then, with the bottle still in his hand, went upstairs again. He rapped at the stranger's door. There was no answer. He rapped again, then pushed the door wide open and entered. It was as he expected. The bed, the room, also was empty, and what was stranger, even to his heavy intelligence, on the bedroom chair and along the rail of the bed, were scattered the garments, the only garments so far as he knew, and the bandages of their guest. His big slouch hat even was cocked jauntily over the bed-post. As Hall stood there, he heard his wife's voice coming out of the depth of the cellar with that rapid telescoping of the syllables and interrogative cocking up of the final words to a high note by which the West Sussex villager is wont to indicate a brisk impatience. "George, you got ward a wand?" At that he turned and hurried down to her. "Janny," he said over the rail of the cellar steps, "'tas the truth what Henry says. He's not in his room, he ain't, and the front door is unbolted." "Are you Spanglish?" "No, I'm a white American. Caucasian. Just learned some Spanish in Miami, Florida, and Los Angeles, California." As they came up the cellar steps, they both, it was afterwards ascertained, fancied that they heard the front door open and shut, but seeing it closed and nothing there, neither said a word to the other about it at the time. Mrs. Hall passed her husband in the passage and ran on first upstairs. Someone sneezed on the staircase. Hall, following 6 steps behind, thought that she heard her sneeze. She, going on first, was under the impression that Hall was sneezing. She flung open the door and stood regarding the room. "Of all the curious," she said. She heard a sniff close behind her head, as it seemed, and turning was surprised to see Hall a dozen feet off on the topmost stair. But in another moment he was beside her. She bent forward and put her hand on the pillow and then under the clothes. "Cold," she said. "He's been up this hour or more." As she did so, a most extraordinary thing happened. The bedclothes gathered themselves together, leapt up suddenly into a sort of peak, and then jumped headlong over the bottom rail. It was exactly as if a hand had clutched them in the center and flung them aside. Immediately after, the stranger's hat hopped off the bedpost, described a whirling flight in the air, through the better part of a circle, and then dashed straight at Mr. Hall's face. Then, as swiftly, came the sponge from the washstand, and then the chair, flinging the stranger's coat and trousers carelessly aside, and laughing dryly in a voice singularly like the stranger's, turned itself up with its 4 legs, and Mrs. Hall seemed to take aim at her for a moment, and charged at her. She screamed and turned, and then the chair legs came gently but firmly against her back, and impelled her and Hall out of the room. The door slammed violently and was locked. The chair and bed seemed to be executing a dance of triumph for a moment, and then abruptly everything was still. Mrs. Hall was left almost in a fainting condition in Mr. Hall's arms on the landing. It was with the greatest difficulty that Mr. Hall and Milly, who had been roused by her scream of alarm, succeeded in getting her downstairs and applying the restoratives customary in such cases. "'Tas spirits," said Mrs. Hall. "I know 'tas spirits. I've read in papers of en, tables and chairs leaping and dancing." "Take a drop more, Janny," said Hall. "'Twill steady ye." "Lock him out," said Mrs. Hall. "Don't let him come in again. I half guessed I might ha' had known, with them goggling eyes and bandaged head, and never going to church of a Sunday, and all they bottles, more'n it's right for anyone to have. He's put the spirits into the furniture. My good old furniture! 'Twas in that very chair my poor dear mother used to sit when I was a little girl. To think it should rise up against me now!" "Just a drop more, Jenny," said Hall. "Your nerves is all upset." They sent Milly across the street through the golden 5 o'clock sunshine to rouse up Mr. Sandy Wadgers, the blacksmith. Mr. Hall's compliments, and the furniture upstairs was behaving most extraordinary. Would Mr. Wadgers come round? He was a knowing man, was Mr. Wadgers, and very resourceful. He took quite a grave view of the case. "I'm darned if it ain't witchcraft," was the view of Mrs. Sandy Wadgers. "You weren't horseshoes for such gentry as he." He came round greatly concerned. They wanted him to lead the way upstairs to the room. But he didn't seem to be in any hurry. He preferred to talk in the passage over the way Huckster's apprentice came out and began taking down the shutters of the tobacco window. He was called over to join the discussion. Mr. Huckster naturally followed in the course of a few minutes. The Anglo-Saxon genius for parliamentary government asserted itself. There was a great deal of talk and no decisive action. "Let's have the facts first," insisted Mr. Sandy Wadgers. "Let's be sure we be acting perfectly right and busting that there door open. A door unbust is always open to bustin', but you can't unbust a door once you've busted in." And suddenly and most wonderfully, the door of the room upstairs opened of its own accord, and as they looked up in amazement, they saw descending the stairs a muffled figure of the stranger, staring more blackly and blankly than ever with those unreasonably large blue glass eyes of his. He came down stiffly and slowly, staring all the time. He walked across the passage staring, then stopped. "Hey, gentle fox! Welcome back. How are you? How is your stream?" "Hello, Jack Emmy." "I am the Invisible Man." Reading The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. Although you may see parts of me periodically. The formula has not been perfected. "Hey, Sleepy Chrissy." "Welcome." Where was I? "Look there," he said, and their eyes followed the direction of his gloved finger and saw a bottle of sarsaparilla hard by the cellar door. Then he entered the parlor and suddenly, swiftly, viciously slammed the door in their faces. "Hey, Clam GLaDOS." I was excessively sleepy, but it was good. Then I saw what you were up to and had to visit. "Awesome. Appreciate you, gentle fox." "Cool eyes." Thank you, Jackemy. And thank you for the follow. Okay. Not a word was spoken until the last echoes of the slam had died away. They stared at one another. "Well, if that don't lick everything," said Mr. Wadgers, and left the alternative unsaid. This story has some phonetic dialogue, so I'll do my best. Here we go. "I'd go in and askin' about it," said Wadgers to Mr. Hall. "I demand an explanation." It took some time to bring the landlady's husband up to that pitch. At last he rapped, opened the door, and got as far as, "Excuse me." "Go to the devil," said the stranger in a tremendous voice, "and shut that door after you." So that brief interview terminated. It's a rather fancy use of ye old green screen. I like it. Thank you, gentle fox. Yes, I thought it was something I should try. I haven't done this before. Okay. Chapter 7, The Unveiling of the Stranger. The stranger went into the little parlor of the Coach and Horses about 5:30 in the morning, and there he remained until near midday, the blinds down, the door shut, and none, after Hall's repulse, venturing near him. All that time he must have fasted. Thrice he rang his bell, the third time furiously and continuously, but no one answered him. "Him and his go to the devil indeed," said Mrs. Hall. Presently came an imperfect rumor of the burglary at the vicarage, and two were put together. Hall, insisted by Wadgers, went off to find Mr. Shuckleforth, the magistrate, and take his advice. No one ventured upstairs. How the stranger occupied himself is unknown. Now and then he would stride violently up and down, and twice came an outburst of curses. a tearing of paper, and a violent smashing of bottles. Oh, hang on. I forgot to shout you out, didn't I, Fox? Gentle Fox ASMR. There it is. Love you too, honey. I've been remiss. Oh, there's my face. I need a quarantine, you guys. More formula. It's unstable. Okay, here we go. The little group of scared but curious people increased. Mrs. Huckster came over, some gay young fellows, resplendent in black ready-made jackets and peak paper ties, for it was Whit Monday, joined the group with confused interrogations. Young Archie Harker distinguished himself by going up the yard and trying to peep under the window blinds. He could see nothing, but gave reason for supposing that he did, and others of the eye-paying youth presently joined him. No worries, just like to encourage more reading for now, though I'm for bed. Okay, Fox, thank you so much for the raid, and thank you for joining me. Get some rest. Your face looks how one mask. That's a secret, Hugador. It's the formula, I say. It was the finest of all possible Whit Mondays, and down the village street stood a row of nearly a dozen booths, a shooting gallery, and on the grass by the forge were 3 yellow and chocolate wagons, and some picturesque strangers of both sexes putting up a coconut shy. The gentlemen wore blue jerseys, the ladies white aprons, and quite fashionable hats with heavy plumes. Wodger of the Purple Fawn and Mr. Jaggers, the cobbler, who also sold old second-hand ordinary bicycles, were stretching a string of Union Jacks and Royal Ensigns, which had originally celebrated the first Victorian Jubilee, across the road. Yes, a human mask. Jugador. And inside, in the artificial darkness of the parlor, into which only one thin jet of sunlight penetrated, the stranger, hungry, we must suppose, and fearful, hidden in his uncomfortable hot wrappings, pored through his dark glasses upon his paper, or chinked his dirty little bottles, and occasionally swore savagely at the boys. Audible, if invisible, outside the windows. In the corner by the fireplace lay the fragments of half a dozen smashed bottles, and a pungent twang of chlorine tainted the air. So much we know from what was heard at the time and from what was subsequently seen in the room. About noon, he suddenly opened his parlor door and stood glaring fixedly at the 3 or 4 people in the bar. Mrs. Hall, he said. Somebody went sheepishly and called for Mrs. Hall. Mrs. Hall appeared after an interval, a little short of breath, but all the fiercer for that. Hall was still out. She had deliberated over this scene, and she came holding a little tray with an unsettled bill upon it. "Is it your bill you're wanting, sir?" she said. "Why wasn't my breakfast laid? Why haven't you prepared my meals and answered my bell? Do you think I live without eating?" "Why isn't my bill paid?" said Mrs. Hall. "That's what I want to know." "I told you 3 days ago I was awaiting a remittance." "I told you 2 days ago I wasn't going to wait no remittances. You can't grumble if your breakfast waits a bit if my bill's been waiting these 5 days, can you?" The stranger swore briefly but vividly. "Nar, nar," from the bar. And I thank you kindly, sir, if you'd keep your swearing to yourself, sir, said Mrs. Hall. The stranger stood looking more like an angry diving helmet than ever. It was universally felt in the bar that Mrs. Hall had the better of him. His next words showed as much. Look here, my good woman, he began. Don't good woman me, said Mrs. Hall. I've told you my remittance hasn't come. Remittance indeed, said Mrs. Hall. Still, I dare say, in my pocket. You told me 3 days ago that you hadn't anything but a sovereign's worth of silver upon you. Well, I've found some more. Hullo, from the bar. I wonder where you found it, said Mrs. Hall. That seemed to annoy the stranger very much. He stamped his feet. What do you mean? He said. That I wonder where you found it, said Mrs. Hall, and before I take any bills, or get any breakfasts, or do any such things whatsoever, you got to tell me one or two things I don't understand, and what nobody don't understand, and what everybody is very anxious to understand. I want to know what you've been doing in my chair upstairs, and I want to know how 'tis your room was empty, and how you got in again. Them as stops in this house comes in by the doors. That's the rule of the house. And that you didn't do. And what I want to know is how you did come in. And I want to know suddenly. The stranger raised his gloved hands, clenched, stamped his foot, and said, Stop! With such extraordinary violence that he silenced her instantly. You don't understand, he said, who I am or what I am. I'll show you, by heaven, I'll show you. Then he put his open palm over his face and withdrew it. The center of his face became a black cavity. Here, he said. He stepped forward and handed Mrs. Hall something which she, staring at his metamorphosed face, accepted automatically. Then, when she saw what it was, she screamed loudly, dropped it, and staggered back. The nose, it was the stranger's nose, pink and shining, rolled on the floor. Then he removed his spectacles, and everyone in the bar gasped. He took off his hat, and with a violent gesture tore at his whiskers and bandages. For a moment they resisted him. A flash of horrible anticipation passed through the bar. Oh, my God, said someone. Then off they came. It was worse than anything. Mrs. Hall, standing open-mouthed and horror-struck, shrieked at what she saw and made for the door of the house. Everyone began to move. They were prepared for scars, disfigurements, tangible horrors. But nothing? The bandages and false hair flew across the passage into the bar, making a hobbledehoy jump to avoid them. What? That's a new word for me. Hang on a second. Hobbledehoy. I gotta look that up. Hobbledehoy.
Hobbledehoy.
Hobbledehoy. A clumsy or awkward youth. Awkward or clumsy. Okay. The bandages and false hair flew across the passage into the bar, making a hobbledehoy jump to avoid them. Everyone tumbled on everyone else down the steps. For the man who stood there shouting some incoherent explanation was a solid gesticulating figure up to the coat collar of him, and then nothingness, no visible thing at all. People down the village heard shouts and shrieks, and looking up the street saw the coach and horses violently firing out its humanity. They saw Mrs. Hall fall down and Mr. Teddy Henfrey jump to avoid tumbling over her. And then they heard the frightful screams of Milly, who, emerging suddenly from the kitchen at the noise of the tumult, had come upon the headless stranger from behind. These increased suddenly. Forthwith, everyone all down the street, the sweet-stuff seller, the coconut-shy proprietor, and his assistant, the swingman, little boys and girls, rustic dandies, smart wenches, smocked elders, and aproned gypsies began running towards the inn. And in a miraculously short space of time, a crowd of perhaps 40 people, and rapidly increasing, swayed and hooted and inquired and exclaimed and suggested in front of Mrs. Hall's establishment. Everyone seemed eager to talk at once, and the result was babble. A small group supported Mrs. Hall, who was picked up in a state of collapse. There was a conference, and the incredible evidence of a vociferous eyewitness. "Oh, Bogey! What's he been doing then? Ain't hurt the girl, has he? Run at with a knife, I believe. No, Ed, I tell ye, I don't mean no manner of speaking. I mean, marn with that Ed. Nonsense! 'Tis some conjuring trick. Fetched off his wrapping, he did." In its struggles to see in through the open door, the crowd formed itself into a straggling wedge, with the more adventurous apex nearest the inn. He stood for a moment. I heard the gal scream, and he turned. I saw her skirts whisk, and he went after her. Didn't take 10 seconds. Back he comes with a knife in his hand and a loaf. Stood just as if he was staring. Not a moment ago. Went in that there door. I tell ye, you ain't got no head at all. You just missed it. There was a disturbance behind, and the speaker stopped to step aside for a little procession that was marching very resolutely towards the house. First, Mr. Hall, very red and determined, then Mr. Bobby Jaffers, the village constable, then the wary Mr. Wadgers. They had come now armed with a warrant. People shouted conflicting information of the recent circumstances. "Ed or no Ed," said Jaffers, "I got to rest in, and rest in I will." Mr. Hall marched up the steps, marched straight to the door of the parlor, and flung it open. "Constable," he said, "do your duty." Jaffers marched in, Hall next, Wadgers last. They saw in the dim light the headless figure facing them, with a gnawed crust of bread in one gloved hand and a chunk of cheese in the other. "That's him," said Hall. "What the devil's this?" came in a tone of angry expostulation from above the collar of the figure. "You're a damned rum customer, mister," said Mr. Jaffers, "but Ed or no Ed, the warrant says body, and duty's duty." "Keep off," said the figure, starting back. Abruptly he whipped down the bread and cheese, and Mr. Hall just grasped the knife on the table in time to save it. Off came the stranger's left glove and was slapped in Jaffers' face. In another moment, Jaffers, cutting short some statement concerning a warrant, had gripped him by the handless wrist and caught his invisible throat. He got a sounding kick on the shin that made him shout, but he kept his grip. Hall sent the knife sliding along the table to Wadgers, who acted as goalkeeper for the offensive, so to speak, and then stepped forward as Jaffers, and the stranger swayed and staggered towards him, clutching and hitting in. A chair stood in the way and went aside with a crash as they came down together. "Get the feet," said Jaffers between his teeth. Mr. Hall, endeavoring to act on instructions, received a sounding kick in the ribs that disposed of him for a moment, and Mr. Wadgers, seeing the decapitated stranger had rolled over and got the upper side of Jaffers, retreated towards the door, knife in hand, and so collided with Mr. Huckster and the Sidderbridge carter coming to the rescue of law and order. At the same moment, down came 3 or 4 bottles from the chiffonnier, and a shot of web of pungency into the air of the room. "I'll surrender!" cried the stranger, though he had Jaffers down, and in another moment he stood up panting, a strange figure, headless and handless, for he had pulled off his right glove now, and as well as his left. "It's no good," he said, as if sobbing for breath. It was the strangest thing in the world to hear that voice coming as if out of empty space, but the Sussex peasants are perhaps the most matter-of-fact people under the sun. Jaffers got up also and produced a pair of handcuffs. Then he stared. "I say," said Jaffers, brought up short by a dim realization of the incongruity of the whole business. "Darn it, can't use 'em, as I can see." The stranger ran his arm down his waistcoat, and as if by a miracle the buttons, to which his empty sleeve pointed, became undone. Then he said something about his shin and stooped down. He seemed to be fumbling with his shoes and socks. "Why," said Huckster suddenly, "that's not a man at all. It's just empty clothes. Look, you can see down his collar and the linings of his clothes. I could put my arm—" He extended his hand, and it seemed to meet something in midair, and he drew it back with a sharp exclamation. "I wish you'd keep your fingers out of my eye," said the aerial voice, in a tone of savage expostulation. "The fact is, I'm all here, head, hands, legs, and all the rest of it, but it happens I'm invisible. It's a confounded nuisance, but I am. That's no reason why I should be poked to pieces by every stupid bumpkin in Iping, is it?" The suit of clothes, now all unbuttoned and hanging loosely upon its unseen supports, stood up, arms akimbo. Several other of the men-folks had now entered the room, so that it was closely crowded. "Invisible, eh?" said Huckster, ignoring the stranger's abuse. "Who ever heard the likes of that?" "It's strange, perhaps, but it's not a crime. Why am I assaulted by a policeman in this fashion?" "Ah, that's a different matter," said Jaffers. "No doubt you are a bit difficult to see in this light, but I got a warrant and it's all correct. What I'm after ain't no invisibility, it's burglary. There's a house been broke into and money took." "Well, and the circumstances certainly point—" "Stuff and nonsense," said the invisible man. "I hope so, sir, but I've got my instructions." "Well," said the stranger, I'll come, but no handcuffs." "It's the regular thing," said Jaffers. "No handcuffs," stipulated the stranger. "Pardon me," said Jaffers. Abruptly, the figure sat down, and before anyone could realize what was being done, the slippers, socks, and trousers had been kicked off under the table. Then he sprang up again and flung off his coat. "Here, stop that," said Jaffers, suddenly realizing what was happening. He gripped at the waistcoat, it struggled, and the shirt slipped out of it and left it limply and empty in his hand. "Hold him!" said Jaffers, loudly. "Once he gets the things off—" "Hold him!" cried everyone, and there was a rush at the fluttering white shirt, which was now all that was visible of the stranger. The shirt sleeve planted a shrewd blow in Hall's face that stopped his open-armed advance, and sent him backward into old Toothsome the sexton. And in another moment the garment was lifted up, and became convulsed and vacantly flapping about the arms, even as a shirt that is being thrust over a man's head. Jaffers clutched at it, and only helped to pull it off. He was struck in the mouth out of the air, and incontinently threw his truncheon and smote Teddy Henfrey savagely upon the crown of his head. "Look out!" said everybody, fencing at random and hitting at nothing. "Hold him! Shut the door! Don't let him loose! I got something! Here he is!" A perfect babel of noises they made. Everybody, it seemed, was being hit all at once, and Sandy Wadgers, knowing as ever, and his wits sharpened by a frightful blow in the nose, reopened the door and led the rout. The others, following incontinently, were jammed for a moment in the corner by the doorway. The hitting continued. Phipps, the Unitarian, had a front tooth broken, and Henfrey was injured in the cartilage of his ear. Jaffers was struck under the jaw, and, turning, caught at something that intervened between him and Huckster in the melee, and prevented their coming together. He felt a muscular chest, and in another moment the whole mass of struggling, excited men shot out into the crowded hall. "I got him!" shouted Jaffers. choking and reeling through them all and wrestling with purple face and swelling veins against his unseen enemy. Men staggered right and left as the extraordinary conflict swayed swiftly towards the house door and went spinning down the half-dozen steps of the inn. Jeffers cried in a strangled voice, holding tight, nevertheless, and making play with his knee, spun around and fell heavily, undermost with his head on the gavel. Only then did his fingers relax. There were excited cries of "hold him," "invisible," and so forth, and a young fellow, a stranger in the place, whose name did not come to light, rushed in at once, caught something, missed his hold, and fell over the constable's prostrate body. Halfway across the road, a woman screamed as something pushed by her. A dog, kicked apparently, yelped and ran howling into Huckster's yard. And with that, the transit of the invisible man was accomplished. For a space, people stood amazed and gesticulating, and then came panic, and scattered them abroad through the village as a gust scatters dead leaves. But Jaffers lay quite still, face upward and knees bent, at the foot of the steps of the inn. Chapter 8. In Transit. The 8th chapter is exceedingly brief and relates that Gibbons, the amateur naturalist of the district, while lying out on the spacious open downs without a soul within a couple of miles of him, as he thought, and almost dozing, heard close to him the sound as of a man coughing, sneezing, and then swearing savagely to himself, and looking beheld nothing. Yet the voice was indisputable. It continued to swear with that breadth and variety that distinguishes the swearing of a cultivated man. It grew to a climax, diminished again, and died away in the distance, going, as it seemed to him, in the direction of Adderdean. It lifted to a spasmodic sneeze and ended. Gibbons had heard nothing of the morning's occurrences, but the phenomenon was so striking and disturbing that his philosophical tranquillity vanished. He got up hastily and hurried down the steepness of the hill towards the village as fast as he could go. Chapter 9. Mr. Thomas Marvel. You must picture Mr. Thomas Marvel as a person of copious, flexible visage, a nose of cylindrical protrusion, a liquorish, ample, fluctuating mouth, and a beard of bristling eccentricity. His figure inclined to ebon point, his short limbs accentuated this inclination. He wore a furry silk hat, and the frequent substitution of twine and shoelaces for buttons, apparent at critical points of his costume, marked a man essentially bachelor. Mr. Thomas Marvel was sitting with his feet in a ditch by the roadside over the down towards Adderdean, about 1.5 miles out of Iping. His feet, save for socks of irregular open work, were bare. His big toes were broad and pricked like the ears of a watchful dog. In a leisurely manner, he did everything in a leisurely manner. He was contemplating trying on a pair of boots. They were the soundest boots he had come across for a long time, but too large for him, whereas the ones he had were, in dry weather, a very comfortable fit, but too thin-soled for damp. Mr. Thomas Marvel hated roomy shoes, but then he hated damp. He had never properly thought out which he hated most, and it was a pleasant day, and there was nothing better to do. So he put the 4 shoes in a graceful group on the turf and looked at them. And seeing them there among the grass and springing agrimony, it suddenly occurred to him that both pairs were exceedingly ugly to see. Hold on, agrimony, that's a new word for me. Agrimony.
Agrimony.
Agrimony? A plant? Okay, it says a plant of the rose family bearing slender flower spikes and spiny fruits. Native to north temperate regions, it has been used traditionally in herbal medicine and dyeing. That's the only definition. Oh well. Oh yes, that does make sense. And seeing them there among the grass and springing agrimony, it suddenly occurred to him that both pairs were exceedingly ugly to see. He was not at all startled by a voice behind him. "They're boots, anyhow," said the voice. "They are charity boots," said Mr. Thomas Marvel, with his head on one side, regarding them distastefully. "And which is the ugliest pair in the whole blessed universe? I'm darned if I know." Said the voice. "I've worn worse. In fact, I've worn none, but none so audacious ugly, if you'll allow the expression. I've been cadging boots in particular for days." Okay, there's another word I'm not familiar with. Cadging? He's been cadging boots? Cadge is to ask for or obtain something to which one is not strictly entitled. Okay. "I've been cadging boots in particular for days, because I was sick of them. They're sound enough, of course, but a gentleman on tramp sees such a thundering lot of his boots, and if you'll believe me, I've raised nothing in the whole blessed country, try as I would, but them. Look at them. And a good country for boots, too, in a general way. But it's just my promiscuous luck. I've got boots in this country 10 years or more, and then they treat you like this." "It's a beast of a country," said the voice, "and pigs for people." "Ain't it?" said Mr. Thomas Marvel. "Lord, but them boots, it beats it." He turned his head over his shoulder to the right to look at the boots of this interlocutor with a view to comparisons, and lo, where the boots of his interlocutor should have been were neither legs nor boots. He was irradiated by the dawn of great amazement. "Where are ye?" said Mr. Thomas Marvel over his shoulder and coming on all fours. He saw a stretch of empty downs with the wind swaying the remote, green-pointed furze bushes. "Am I drunk?" said Mr. Marvel. "Have I had visions? Was I talking to myself? What the—" "Don't be alarmed," said a voice. "None of your ventriloquizing me," said Mr. Thomas Marvel, rising sharply to his feet. "Where are you? Alarmed indeed." "Don't be alarmed," repeated the voice. "You'll be alarmed in a minute, you silly fool," said Mr. Thomas Marvel. "Where are you? Let me get my mark on you." "Are you buried?" said Mr. Thomas Marvel after an interval. There was no answer. Mr. Thomas Marvel stood bootless and amazed, his jacket nearly thrown off. "Peewit," said a peewit, very remote. Said a peewit. Okay, he's really giving me vocabulary words tonight, Mr. Wells. Peewit. Never heard that word. Oh, it's a bird. A northern lapwing. It's a small bird, black wings and a white belly. It's got a little white on the neck too. Okay, so I'm going to assume that the peewit makes that sound, because it says peewit, said a peewit, very remote. "Peewit indeed," said Mr. Thomas Marvel. "This ain't no time for foolery." The down was desolate, east and west, north and south. The road, with its shallow ditches and white bordering stakes, ran smooth and empty north and south, and save for that peewit, the blue sky was empty too. "So help me, Mr. Thomas Marvel," shuffling his coat onto his shoulders again, "it's the drink. I might have known." Oh, sorry. "It's not the drink," said the voice. "You keep your nerves steady. Ow, said Mr. Marvel, and his face grew white amidst its patches. It's the drink, his lips repeated noiselessly. He remained staring about him, rotating slowly backwards. I could have swore I heard a voice. Oh, I could have swore I heard a voice, he whispered. Of course you did. It's there again, said Mr. Marvel, closing his eyes and clasping his hand on his brow with a tragic gesture. He was suddenly taken by the collar and shaken violently, and left more dazed than ever. Don't be a fool, said the voice. I'm off my bloomin' chump, said Mr. Marvel. It's no good. It's frettin' about them blarsted boots. I'm off my blessed bloomin' chump, or its spirits. Neither one thing nor the other, said the voice. Listen. Chump, said Mr. Marvel. 1 minute, said the voice penetratingly, tremulous with self-control. Well, said Mr. Thomas Marvel, with a strange feeling of having been dug in the chest by a finger. You think I'm just imagination? Just imagination? What else can you be? Said Mr. Thomas Marvel, rubbing the back of his neck. Very well, said the voice, in a tone of relief. Then I'm going to throw flints at you until you think differently. But where are you? The voice made no answer. Whiz came a flint, apparently out of the air, and missed Mr. Marvel's shoulder by a hair's breadth. Mr. Marvel, turning, saw a flint jerk up into the air, trace a complicated path, hang for a moment, and then fling at his feet with almost invisible rapidity. He was too amazed to dodge. Whiz it came and ricocheted from a bare toe into the ditch. Mr. Thomas Marvel jumped a foot and howled aloud. Then he started to run, tripped over an unseen obstacle. He came head over heels into a sitting position. Now, said the voice, as a third stone curved upward and hung in the air above the tramp, am my imagination? Mr. Marvel, by way of reply, struggled to his feet and was immediately rolled over again. He lay quiet for a moment. If you struggle any more, said the voice, I shall throw the flint at your head. It's a fair do, said Mr. Thomas Marvel, sitting up, taking his wounded toe in hand and fixing his eye on the third missile. I don't understand it. Stones flinging themselves, stones talking. Put yourself down, rot away. I'm done. The third flint fell. It's very simple, said the voice. I'm an invisible man. Tell us something I don't know, said Mr. Marvel, gasping with pain. Where you've hid, how you do it, I don't know. I'm beat. That's all, said the voice. I'm invisible. That's what you want to understand. Anyone could see that. There was no need for you to be so confounded impatient, mister. Now then, give us a notion. How are you hid? I'm invisible, that's the great point. And what I want you to understand is this. But whereabouts? Interrupted Mr. Marvel. Here, 6 yards in front of you. Oh, come, I ain't blind. You'll be telling me next you're just thin air. I'm not one of your ignorant tramps. Yes, I am. Thin air. You're looking through me. What? Ain't there any stuff to you? Vox et... what is it? Jabber? Is it that? I'm just a human being, solid, needing food and drink, needing covering too, but I'm invisible. You see, invisible. Simple idea, invisible. What, real like? Yes, real. Let's have a hand of you, said Marvel. If you are real, it won't be so darn out of the way like then. Lord, he said, how you made me jump, gripping me like that. He felt the hand that had closed round his wrist with his disengaged fingers, and his fingers went timorously up the arm, patted a muscular chest, and explored a bearded face. Marvel's face was astonishment. Timorously, I forget what that means. Timorous. I think I spelled that right. Let's double check here. Timorous. Timorous showing or suffering from nervousness, fear, or lack of confidence. Timorous, timorously.
Timorous.
Yeah, timorous. Okay, where was I? He felt the hand that had closed round his wrist with his disengaged fingers, and his fingers went timorously up the arm, patted a muscular chest, and explored a bearded face. Marvel's face was astonishment. "I'm dashed," he said. "If this don't be cockfighting, most remarkable. And there I can see a rabbit clean through you, 'arf a mile away. Not a bit of you visible except..." He scrutinized the apparently empty space keenly. "You haven't been eating bread and cheese?" he asked, holding the invisible arm. "You're quite right, and it's not quite assimilated into the system." "Ah," said Mr. Marvel, "sort of ghostly, though." "Of course, all this isn't half so wonderful as you think." "It's quite wonderful enough for my modest wants," said Mr. Thomas Marvel. "How'd you manage it? How the deuce is it done?" "It's too long a story, and besides, I tell you, the whole business fairly beats me," said Mr. Marvel. "What I want to say at present is this. I need help. I have come to that. I came upon you suddenly. I was wandering mad with rage, naked, impotent. I could have murdered, and I saw you." "Lord," said Mr. Marvel. "I came up behind you, hesitated, went on." Mr. Marvel's expression was eloquent. Then stopped. "Here," I said, "is an outcast like myself. This is the man for me. So I turned back and came to you. You and..." "Lord," said Mr. Marvel. "But I'm all in a tizzy. May I ask, how is it? And what you may be requiring in the way of help, Invisible?" "I want you to help get me clothes and shelter, and then with other things. I've left them long enough. If you won't, well, but you will. Must." "Look here," said Mr. Marvel, "I'm too flabbergasted. Don't knock me about any more, and leave me go. I must get steady a bit, and you've pretty near broken my toe. It's all so unreasonable. Empty downs, empty sky, nothing visible for miles except the bosom of nature. And then comes a voice out of heaven, and stones, and a fist. Lord." "Pull yourself together," said the voice, "for you have to do the job I've chosen for you." Mr. Marvel blew out his cheeks, and his eyes were round. "I've chosen you," said the voice. "You are the only man except some of those fools down there who knows there is such a thing as an invisible man. You have to be my helper. Help me, and I will do great things for you. An invisible man is a man of power." He stopped for a moment to sneeze violently. "But if you betray me," he said, "if you fail to do as I direct you..." He paused and tapped Mr. Marvel's shoulder smartly. Mr. Marvel gave a yelp of terror at the touch. "I don't want to betray you," said Mr. Marvel, edging away from the direction of the fingers. "Don't you go a-thinking that, whatever you do. All I want to do is help you. Just tell me what I gotta do. Lord, whatever you want done, that I'm most willing to do." Okay, I'm gonna stop there tonight, guys, because I'm tired and